The air in the grand St. Giles Cathedral was thick not with joyous celebration, but with the chilling frost of humiliation. Before God and 300 members of London's high society, Lady Ella Vance stood in her gown of ivory silk, a perfect bride. But the man beside her, the formidable Alistair Beaumont VI, Earl of Blackwood, spoke his vows as if they were a death sentence. As the ceremony concluded, he turned not to kiss his new wife, but to issue a decree, in a voice like shattering ice, loud enough for the front pews to hear, "You have your title, madam. Do not expect anything more." This is the story of a marriage born of ruin and duty, a bride rejected at the altar, and the cold, broken Earl, who would discover that the woman he tried to cast aside was the only one who could save him from himself. The year of our Lord 1888 was a year of sharp contrasts in England. While London hummed with the electric pulse of industry and new money, ancient aristocratic houses were crumbling under the weight of their own history. None felt this decline more acutely than Lord Alistair Beaumont VI, Earl of Blackwood. His title was as old as the Norman conquest, his bloodline pristine, but the Blackwood coffers were little more than a gilded echoing void. The grand estate Blackwood Manor, a Gothic masterpiece of stone and sorrow in the heart of Northumberland, was mortgaged to its gargoyles. Alistair was a man forged from the same harsh stone as his ancestral home. At 32 he was devastatingly handsome in a severe, unforgiving way. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, his eyes a startling pale grey that seemed to hold the permanent chill of a winter sky. He was known in the ton as the Winter Earl, a man whose heart was rumoured to have been buried with his first wife, Isabella, who had been taken by consumption 5 years prior. Since then he had been a phantom in society, a figure of grim duty and silent grief. Duty, however, had now presented him with a most unpalatable solution to his financial ruin marriage. The bride-to-be was Lady Ella Vance. Her name carried the lady as a courtesy, a recent acquisition by her father, Baron Vance, a shipping magnate whose fortune was as vast and new as Alistair's was ancient and depleted. Ella was the price of salvation. Her dowry, a staggering sum, would not only clear the Blackwood debts, but also fund the modernization of its tenant farms and failing coal mine. Ella knew exactly what she was a transaction. She was 24, considered on the shelf by society's cruel standards. She was not a classic beauty. Her hair was a warm chestnut rather than a fashionable blonde, her eyes a deep, intelligent brown, and her features were pleasant, but not striking. Her true assets were her sharp mind, her quiet resilience, and a profound kindness that she kept shielded from a world that judged women by their face and fortune alone. She had read of the Winter Earl, of his tragic past and his cold demeanour. She harboured no romantic illusions. This was a merger of his title and her father's gold. Their wedding day was a study in grim pageantry. St. Giles Cathedral was filled with flowers that seemed to wilt in the sheer cold emanating from the groom. Alistair stood at the altar, his jaw set like granite, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window behind the vicar, seeing not saints, but the ghosts of his own failures. When Ella walked down the aisle, a murmur went through the crowd. Her dress, made of the finest Brussels lace, was exquisite, but it couldn't hide the nervous tension in her shoulders or the determined set of her chin. She met Alistair's eyes only once, and the look she received was one of undisguised contempt. It was the look a man gives a necessary evil. The ceremony was a blur of hollow words and forced responses. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, a strained silence fell. Alistair didn't lift her veil. He did not kiss her. It was then, in that sacred space, that he leaned in and delivered his whisper of ice. You have your title, madam. Do not expect anything more." The humiliation was a physical blow stealing the air from her lungs, but Ella Vance was made of stronger stuff than her delicate appearance suggested. She held her head high, her back ramrod straight, and endured the receiving line with a placid smile that did not reach her eyes. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a suffocating silence. The Earl sat opposite her in the carriage, staring out at the bleak rolling hills as if she were nothing more than a piece of luggage. When they finally arrived, the manor rose before them, like a wounded beast, magnificent yet melancholic. Its grey stone walls were slick with moss, and many of its countless windows were dark and lifeless. The staff, led by the stern, silver-haired housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, were lined up in the grand entrance hall. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and pity. Alistair addressed them without a single glance at his new wife. "This is the Countess of Blackwood. She will be residing in the East Wing. See to her needs." He then turned to Ella, his voice a low, brutal command. "The East Wing is yours. The rest of this house and my life are my own. We will take dinner separately. We will not encounter each other unless absolutely necessary. Is that understood?" Ella felt a flicker of defiance. "And what shall I tell society when they ask after the happy couple, my lord?" His grey eyes narrowed a flash of Arctic fire in their depths. "You are intelligent, Lady Blackwood. That is the one quality your father boasted of. I trust you will invent a suitable narrative. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have estate business to attend to." He turned on his heel and strode towards a heavy oak door, disappearing into the shadows of his library, leaving her alone in the cavernous, cold hall. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "This way, my lady." The East Wing was spacious and richly appointed, but it felt like a gilded cage. It had its own sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room, all overlooking a neglected rose garden. It was utterly isolated from the West Wing where the Earl resided. That night, Ella ate a solitary dinner served on fine china, the food tasting of ashes in her mouth. She was a countess. She was a wife, and she had never felt more alone in her life. Staring out the window at the skeletal branches of the roses clawing at the glass, she made a silent vow. He may have rejected her as a wife, but she was the Countess of Blackwood now. This house was her home, and she would not be a ghost within its walls. The first weeks of Ella's marriage were a lesson in isolation. Alistair was true to his word. She saw him only on Sundays, when they endured the excruciatingly tense carriage ride to the local parish church, sitting side by side in complete silence, a perfect, miserable tableau for the prying eyes of the local gentry. He was a phantom in his own home, his presence marked only by the distant sound of a closing door or the sight of his lone figure riding out across the moors at dawn. The staff treated her with a cautious formal respect, dictated by Mrs. Gable's ironclad professionalism. They called her "my lady," but their eyes held a sorrowful understanding. They had loved the first countess. The vibrant and beautiful Isabella, and Ella was a pale, wealthy ghost in her place. Instead of succumbing to despair, Ella let her sharp, inquisitive mind take the lead. She began to explore. Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of forgotten history. Dust-cloths covered furniture, like shrouds and portraits of stern-faced Beaumonts, watched her with judgmental eyes. The house was groaning under the weight of neglect. There was a pervasive dampness in the air, the carpets were frayed, and the once magnificent gardens were surrendering to weeds. Her explorations eventually led her to the heart of the house's problems, the library. It was Alistair's sanctuary, the one place she was implicitly forbidden to go. But one afternoon, knowing he had ridden out to the far edge of the estate, she slipped inside. It was a breathtaking room, with 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive unlit fireplace. But like the rest of the house, it was suffering. Books lay in untidy piles, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. On the enormous oak desk, however, was a collection of papers that were clearly in current use, the estate ledgers. Forgetting her trespass, Ella's curiosity took over. Her father had insisted on her having a practical education, believing a woman should understand finance as well as she understood French. With a deft, practiced hand, she opened the main ledger. What she found horrified her. It was worse than she had imagined. The dowry had indeed cleared the primary debts, but the estate itself was hemorrhaging money. The steward, a man named Mr. Finch, was competent but overwhelmed and old-fashioned. He was paying exorbitant prices for supplies from long-held familiar merchants. The tenant rents were in arrears not from unwillingness, but from the poor yields of their land. The coal mine was operating at a loss, using outdated equipment that was both inefficient and dangerous. Alistair was not a fool, but he was drowning in grief and pride, managing the crisis with a stoic, desperate hand, but without the innovative vision it required. He was trying to save his legacy, using the methods that had built it, not realizing the world had changed. An idea bold and dangerous began to form in Ella's mind. She could not be his wife, but she could be his countess. She could not mend his heart, but she could help mend his home. She began her work in secret. She could not approach the steward directly. He would see it as a slight to the Earl. So she took a different path. She started with the household accounts which Mrs. Gable managed, pleading a desire to understand her new home. She asked to review them. Mrs. Gable was hesitant, but the request was reasonable. Ella spent days poring over the household expenses. With quiet, gentle suggestions, she pointed out discrepancies. "Mrs. Gable," she'd say softly, "I notice we purchase our flour from a supplier in York. My father's agent in Newcastle, a Mr. David Chen, supplies all his ships. His prices are nearly 1/3 less, and the quality is superb. Perhaps we could request a sample." She did the same with the chandler, the butcher, and the linen supplier. She never commanded. She merely suggested and provided logical, well-researched alternatives. Within a month, the household expenses had dropped by 20% without any loss in quality. Mrs. Gable, a woman who appreciated efficiency above all else, began to look at the new countess with a newfound grudging respect. Emboldened, Ella turned her attention to the tenants. She began visiting them not as a lady making a charitable call, but as an interested landowner. She brought her lady's maid, Jane, for propriety, but she spoke to the farmers directly. She listened to their woes about the poor soil drainage and the blight that had affected the potato crop. She remembered reading a treatise on modern agricultural techniques. In the dead of night, she would sneak into the library, find the book and study it by candlelight in her room. The next day, she would visit the tenants again. "Mr. McGregor Tondorf." She might say, "I was reading about a Dutch method of crop rotation, using clover to enrich the soil. Do you think it might have some merit here?" She used a small portion of her personal allowance, a fund separate from the dowry, to purchase new seeds for a few of the farmers to experiment with. She didn't present it as a gift, but as an investment in the estate. Alistair noticed the changes, but he misinterpreted their source. He saw the improved figures in the household accounts and credited Mrs. Gable's thriftiness. He heard whispers of renewed optimism from the tenants and assumed Mr. Finch had finally heeded his commands to be stricter. He remained utterly oblivious to the silent, steady hand of the woman he had banished to the East Wing. He saw her only as a symbol of his humiliation, the price he had to pay. He was unaware that in the ledgers and fields of Blackwood, his rejected bride was quietly becoming the architect of its salvation. And as the finances of his home began to mend the cracks in his own frozen heart, though he would never admit it were becoming perilously close to forming, the Northumberland autumn arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it a storm that raged for 2 days, tearing at the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor. Rain fell in relentless wind-whipped sheets, and the river that snaked through the low-lying farmlands swelled into a brown, churning torrent. Alistair was in London, a trip he had been forced to make to appease his last remaining creditors with proof of his new solvency. He had left without a word to Ella, his departure communicated only through his valet. On the second night of the storm, a frantic knock came at the door to the east wing. It was young Thomas, a stable boy soaked to the bone and shivering, his eyes wide with fear. "My lady," he gasped, "it's the miller's cottage. The river's burst its banks. The MacGregor family is trapped, and the cottage is flooding fast." Ella's mind raced. Mr. Finch, the steward, lived in the village 2 miles away, and the road was likely impassable. Mrs. Gable was a formidable manager of the household, but this was a crisis beyond her scope. There was no one else. "Saddle my horse, Thomas," she commanded, her voice calm and clear, betraying none of the fear coiling in her stomach. "And gather every able-bodied man you can find. Tell them to bring ropes and lanterns." Ignoring the protests of her maid, Jane Ella pulled on a pair of her husband's old riding trousers she'd found in a forgotten chest, covered them with a heavy cloak, and met the men in the courtyard. They looked at her, this quiet, city-bred lady, with skepticism. "The Earl is away," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "In his absence I will act. Are the MacGregors to be abandoned because their master is not here? We are Blackwood. We do not abandon our own." Her words and the surprising sight of their countess, dressed for action rather than a drawing-room, stirred them. With a renewed sense of purpose, they rode into the teeth of the storm. The scene at the river was chaos. The MacGregors' small stone cottage was an island in a raging flood, the water already halfway up the ground-floor windows. Ella could see the family, Mr. and Mrs. MacGregor, and their 2 small children, huddled at an upper window, their faces pale with terror in the flickering lantern light. Working with the men, Ella devised a plan. Using a strong rope tied to 2 ancient oaks on either side of the flooded expanse, they created a lifeline. One by one, the estate workers with a second rope tied around their waists pulled themselves through the treacherous current. They brought back first the children, then Mrs. MacGregor, and finally her husband, who had refused to leave until his family was safe. Ella had the shivering, soaked family brought directly to the manor. She ordered Mrs. Gable to open up a suite of unused guest rooms near the kitchens to fill the tubs with hot water and to provide warm food and dry clothes. The housekeeper looked at her aghast. "My lady, these are tenant farmers in the main house. They are cold, terrified, and they are our people, Mrs. Gable." Ella replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "See to it." For the first time, Mrs. Gable obeyed not just the title but the woman. Alistair returned 2 days later to a manor buzzing with the story of the rescue. The storm had passed, leaving a trail of debris and mud. He found Mr. Finch in his study, the steward's face, a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "My lord," Finch began, "I must offer my apologies. I was cut off by the flood, unable to reach the MacGregor farm." "I heard the cottage was lost," Alistair cut in. His voice clipped. "What of the family?" "They are safe, my lord, housed here in the manor, by the Countess." Alistair froze. The Countess did what? Finch recounted the entire night's events, Lady Blackwood taking command, devising the rescue, and bringing the family into the main house. "She was magnificent, my lord. Truly, the men would have followed her into the river itself, A storm of a different kind brewed in Alistair's eyes. Fury, confusion, and a sliver of something he couldn't name warred within him. She had overstepped her bounds. She had interfered. He strode from the library, his boots echoing on the marble floors, his destination, the East Wing. He found her not in her parlour, but in the guest rooms she had opened, sitting by the bedside of the youngest McGregor child who was sleeping soundly. Ella was reading to her softly from a book of fairy tales. She looked up as he entered, her expression, calm, her presence, filling the room with a quiet warmth that felt utterly foreign in his cold house. "My lord," she said, rising to her feet. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "You bring tenants into my home. You take command of my men. You are the countess, not the steward." Ella did not flinch. "Your steward was unavailable. Your men were leaderless. And your family was in danger of drowning. I did what was necessary. What was necessary was to wait for my return." "There was no time to wait, my lord," she replied, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The water was rising. Would you have preferred I upheld protocol while a child drowned? Is the pride of Blackwood worth that price?" Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as the merchant's daughter he had been forced to wed, not as a reminder of his financial failure, but as a woman of strength and startling capability. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the weariness in her eyes, and the unyielding steel in her spine. He had no answer for her. The raw, unassailable logic of her actions left him speechless. For the first time since he had met her, the Winter Earl was silenced by a sliver of warmth. He turned, unable to process the turmoil of emotions she had ignited, and left the room without another word. But as he walked back to the cold solitude of his wing, he knew something had irrevocably shifted. A crack had appeared in the ice he had so carefully constructed around his heart, and through it a dangerous, unwelcome light was beginning to shine. He also found a guest in his home, his charming neighbour Lord Caspian Thorne, who expressed his deep concern for the estate and his admiration for the Countess's bravery. Alistair felt an unfamiliar, deeply unpleasant sensation, the possessive growl of a husband. Lord Caspian Thorne was everything Alistair Beaumont was not. Where Alistair was dark and severe, Caspian was golden and affable, with a politician's easy smile and a predator's calculating eyes. His estate Thorncroft bordered Blackwood's eastern territories, and he had long coveted the richer coal seams that lay beneath Alistair's land. Caspian saw Alistair's financial ruin and subsequent marriage as an opportunity. He became a frequent visitor to Blackwood Manor in the weeks following the flood, always under the guise of neighbourly concern. "My dear Blackwood," he would say, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I was so relieved to hear the estate weathered the storm. And your new countess. What a treasure. A true English rose." Alistair endured these visits with barely concealed hostility. He loathed Thorne's slick charm and saw the avarice glittering behind his friendly facade. But it was Caspian's attention to Ella that stoked a truly primal anger in him. Caspian would direct his conversation to her, complimenting her intelligence, her bravery, her management of the household details he had clearly gleaned from gossiping servants. He treated her not as the merchant's daughter, but as the brilliant mistress of the manor, a stark contrast to Alistair's continued deliberate coldness. Ella, for her part, was polite but distant. Her sharp mind easily pierced Caspian's veneer of charm, sensing the ambition beneath. She understood he was a threat, a wolf circling their weakened flock. She found herself watching Alistair during these encounters, seeing the tightening of his jaw, the dangerous glint in his grey eyes. He was protecting his territory, she realized, and whether he knew it or not, that territory now included her. The tension came to a head at the annual Northumberland Hunt Ball, a grand affair that the Beaumonts were obligated to attend. It was to be their first public appearance together since their wedding day. The fragile truce they had established since the flood, a truce of avoided glances and unspoken acknowledgements, shattered in the carriage ride to the ball. "Lord Thorn will be in attendance," Alistair stated, his voice flat. "He will likely seek you out." "I am capable of managing a conversation, my lord," Ella replied coolly. "He does not want conversation. He wants leverage." Alistair countered, his gaze intense. "He sees you as a weakness in my armor, a way to get to my land." The irony was so bitter, Ella almost laughed. "A weakness I thought my purpose was to be your strength, a walking dowry to shore up your fortunes." His jaw tightened. "Do not be naive. You are a novelty. A wealthy, intelligent woman, married to the Winter Earl. Thorn thinks he can charm you, turn you against me, perhaps even uncover some marital discontent to use as gossip." "And is there no marital discontent to uncover?" She challenged, her voice soft but sharp as a shard of glass. The question hung between them, thick and suffocating. Alistair had no answer. He simply looked away out into the darkness. "Just be careful, Ella." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it spoken in his low, gravelly voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The ballroom was a dazzling sea of silks, jewels, and whispered speculation. When the Earl and Countess of Blackwood were announced, a hush fell over the crowd. They made a striking, if forbidding, couple. Alistair tall and imposing in his black evening dress, and Ella elegant in a gown of deep emerald green that brought out the warmth in her eyes, a string of her mother's pearls, her only adornment. As Alistair predicted, Caspian Thorn descended upon them almost immediately. After exchanging curt pleasantries with Alistair, he turned his full attention on Ella. "My dear Countess," he purred, "you are the vision of the evening. Blackwood does not deserve his good fortune." He took her hand, his thumb stroking her glove in a gesture that was far too intimate. Alistair's hand rested on the small of Ella's back, a possessive branding heat that burned through the fabric of her dress. "Thorn," he said, his voice dangerously low. "My wife and I were about to dance." It was a blatant lie, but Caspian could do little but acquiesce. Alistair led Ella to the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, strong and sure, guiding her with a firm, practiced hand. They moved together in silence, surrounded by the swirling crowd, but utterly isolated in their own bubble of tension. "He is trying to unsettle you," Alistair murmured, his lips close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "And you," she whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you trying to do?" He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the icy mask slipped. His grey eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't decipher, anger, possession, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable. "I am protecting what is mine." Later in the evening, Caspian found Ella alone near the terrace as she sought a moment of fresh air. "Your husband seems rather territorial tonight," he said, stepping into her space. "One might think he cares for you." "My husband is protective of his name and his honor. Lord Thorn, as am I," she replied, her chin held high. Caspian's smile turned predatory. "His honor is a fragile thing, held together by your father's money. Debts have a way of reappearing, Countess. Powerful friends can become powerful enemies. A woman as clever as you should know when to back the winning side. It was a veiled threat, a clear indication that he was actively working to undermine Alistair. Before Ella could respond, Alistair was there, seeming to materialize from the shadows. He placed himself between them, a formidable wall of anger. "Thorn!" He snarled his voice, a quiet menace that was more terrifying than any shout. "If you ever address my wife in such a manner again, you will find that my honor is something I am more than capable of defending with or without her dowry. Now leave." Caspian Thorn, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. Faced with the raw fury of the Winter Earl, he gave a short, stiff bow and retreated. Alistair turned to Ella, his chest rising and falling heavily. The silence stretched thick with the unspoken. He had not just defended his name. He had defended her. He had called her my wife, with a conviction that had been absent from their vows. "We are leaving," he said abruptly. The carriage ride home was as silent as the one before, but this time the silence was not empty. It was charged with a new, terrifying awareness. Alistair had claimed her publicly and fiercely, and Ella, much to her own dismay, found that a part of her, a part she had thought long dead, had thrilled to that claim. The cold Earl had shown his fire, and it had been for her. The incident at the ball created a subtle but definite shift in the dynamics of Blackwood Manor. Alistair no longer confined himself entirely to the West Wing. He would occasionally take his dinner in the main dining room, sitting at the opposite end of the long table from Ella, the space between them a vast, uncharted territory. Their conversations were stilted, confined to the weather or estate matters, yet the mere act of sharing a room was a monumental step. Ella found him in the library more often, sometimes poring over the very ledgers she secretly amended. She would watch him from the doorway, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he ran a weary hand through his dark hair. A strange protective ache would bloom in her chest. She saw not the fearsome Winter Earl, but a man carrying the weight of centuries on his shoulders. Her curiosity about him, and about the first Countess Isabella, grew into a quiet obsession. The staff never spoke of her their loyalty to the Earl absolute. Her portrait, which Ella knew must exist, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had been erased, yet her ghost was in every cold, empty corridor. One rainy afternoon, driven by a restless energy, Ella found herself in the West Wing. She had never dared to venture there, respecting the one boundary Alistair had set. But a deep-seated need to understand him propelled her forward. The wing was even more austere than the rest of the house. It was a purely masculine domain, smelling of leather wood smoke and Alistair himself. At the end of a long hallway was a single locked door. It was different from the others, made of a lighter wood with a small, tarnished brass handle. It felt private. Her hand trembled as she tested the knob. Locked. Over the next few days, she couldn't get the door out of her mind. She finally approached Mrs. Gable, her question carefully phrased. "Mrs. Gable, I am trying to complete an inventory of the manor's contents. There is a locked room at the far end of the West Wing. I will need the key." The housekeeper's face became a stony mask. "That room is not to be entered, my lady. The Earl's orders." "And what room is it?" Ella pressed gently. Mrs. Gable hesitated, her hands twisting in her apron. "It was the late Countess's sitting room." The answer settled in Ella's heart like a stone. It was a shrine, a sealed tomb of memories he could not bear to face, or perhaps could not bear to live without. That evening, a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil in Ella's soul. She couldn't sleep. Wrapped in a dressing gown, she walked the silent house, eventually finding herself standing before the forbidden door once more. To her utter shock, It was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of lamplight spilled into the dark hallway. Alistair was inside. Her heart pounding, she pushed the door open. The room was just as Isabella had left it 5 years ago. It was a light, feminine space, with floral wallpaper and delicate furniture. A half-finished piece of embroidery sat in a hoop by the chair, the needle still threaded. And everywhere on every surface were sketches and watercolors of breathtaking skill. They depicted the hills of Blackwood, the faces of the tenants, the wild beauty of the moors. Alistair was standing before a large draped object in the corner. He didn't seem to have heard her enter. With a shaking hand, he pulled the dustcloth away. It was a portrait of Isabella. She was stunningly beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a summer sky. She radiated life and joy, a stark contrast to the gloom of Blackwood. Alistair stared at it. His shoulders slumped, his entire being exuding a grief so profound it was a tangible force in the room. "She was the sun," he said, his voice thick and raw. He had known Ella was there all along, and when she died, she took all the light with her. Ella said nothing, simply stood in the doorway giving him space for his sorrow. She loved this place. He continued, his back still to her. But it killed her. The dampness of these old walls. It settled in her lungs. We had no money for doctors, for trips to warmer climates. I was a titled pauper, and my pride killed her as surely as the illness did. He finally turned to face Ella, and his eyes were not cold grey stone, but shimmering pools of unshed tears. The formidable Earl was gone, and in his place was a broken, guilt-ridden man. "I took your father's money to save these stones, this land that she loved," he confessed, his voice cracking. "And I hated you for it. I hated you because you were the living, breathing proof of my failure. Every time I looked at you, I saw her dying. I saw the price of my incompetence." The confession laid him bare. All his coldness, his cruelty on their wedding day, his distance, it was never about her. It was all about Isabella. It was about a grief so deep and a guilt so consuming that he had to build a wall of ice around himself just to survive. Ella slowly walked into the room, her heart aching not with jealousy for the beautiful woman in the portrait, but with a wave of overwhelming compassion for the man standing before her. She stopped in front of him and did something incredibly bold. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "You honor her memory by saving her home, Alistair," she said softly, using his name for the second time. "Grief is not a weakness, but you cannot let it be a tomb for you as well." He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his stone-like face. He didn't speak. He just stood there, letting her small, warm hand rest against his skin, a tiny point of connection in his vast, cold world. In that room, surrounded by the ghost of his first love, the marriage of Alistair and Ella truly began. The foundation was not passion or romance, but a shared, quiet understanding of a profound and terrible pain. He had finally let her see the man behind the mask, and she in turn had offered not judgment, but grace. The night in Isabella's room was a watershed. The wall of ice between Alistair and Ella had not so much melted as been acknowledged as a structure of grief, not malice. A quiet, fragile alliance formed in its wake. Alistair began to speak to her, truly speak. He would seek her out in the library not with a specific purpose, but simply to be in the same room. He asked her opinion on a new crop rotation schedule, and was floored by her detailed, knowledgeable response. He finally saw the evidence of her secret work. "The household accounts are significantly improved," he said one evening, looking at her over the rim of his spectacles. Mrs. Gable has become a miracle worker. Ella met his gaze evenly. Mrs. Gable is an excellent manager. She simply required better information on suppliers. Alistair stared at her, the realization dawning on him. The suppliers, the tenant morale, the small, steady improvements. It had been her, all of it. "It was you," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Awe colored his voice. "You did all this, without a word." "I am the Countess of Blackwood," she replied simply. "The prosperity of this estate is my concern as well." For the first time, he saw her dowry not as a buyout, but as an investment. And her, the investor, as a partner, he had foolishly and arrogantly ignored. Respect potent and sincere began to replace the resentment in his heart. Their newfound alliance would be tested sooner than they knew. Lord Caspian Thorne, frustrated by his inability to charm Ella or intimidate Alistair, decided to escalate his attack. He was not just a greedy neighbour. He had systematically bought up the old, forgotten debts of the Blackwood estate from minor creditors, consolidating them under his control. A solicitor's letter arrived one morning. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. Thorne was calling in all the debts at once, claiming a breach of the original loan agreements due to mismanagement. He cited the recent flood and loss of the McGregor's cottage as proof. The amount was astronomical, far more than the estate's liquid assets could cover, even with Ella's dowry. It was a death blow designed to force the sale of the Blackwood lands, a sale where Thorne would be the only viable bidder. Alistair was apoplectic. He paced the library like a caged panther, fury rolling off him in waves. He's fabricated the claim, the loans were restructured. He's using the flood as a pretext. The man is a viper. Ella, however, was calm. She stood at the large library desk, the solicitor's letter spread before her. Her mind, trained in the world of commerce and contracts, was already dissecting the attack. "Fury will not help us, Alistair," she said, her voice cutting through his rage. "He has documents. We need to find better ones." And so they began to work. For the next week, the library became their war room. The distinction between Earl and Countess husband and wife dissolved. They were two minds united against a common enemy. Alistair, with his deep ancestral knowledge of the estate, retrieved dusty deed boxes from the vaults boxes that hadn't been opened in generations. Ella, with her sharp, methodical mind, began the painstaking process of cross-referencing every loan document, every land title, every letter of agreement against the claims in Thorne's letter. They worked late into the nights, sustained by coffee, brought by a silently supportive Mrs. Gable. They would argue over legal phrasing, debate the meaning of a centuries-old clause, and occasionally share a moment of weary camaraderie. In this crucible of stress and ink-stained fingers, they discovered a rhythm. He would explain the history of a tenant agreement. She would explain the modern financial implications. He was the history, the land, the legacy. She was the present, the numbers, the strategy. One night, slumped over a map of the estate from 1780, Ella found it. It was a small discrepancy, an annotation in the margin concerning the mineral rights of the Eastern Territories, the very land Thorne coveted for its coal. Alistair, look at this. She breathed her finger, tracing the faded script. The mineral rights for the East Reach were separated from the land title in a lease agreement with the Durham Mining Guild. That lease expired in 1820, but it states the rights were to revert not to the landowner, but to the Crown, unless a new claim was filed. Alistair leaned over her shoulder, his arm brushing hers, the contact sending a jolt through them both. He read the passage, his eyes widening. My grandfather never refiled the claim. He thought it was pointless. The seams were believed to be exhausted. And modern surveying techniques have proven him wrong. Ella finished, her mind racing. Thorn isn't just trying to buy the land. He's trying to steal the coal beneath it. But his entire foreclosure is based on the value of the estate, including those mineral rights. If Blackwood doesn't legally own them, then the valuation of the assets against the debt is fraudulent. It was the loophole they needed. Thorn, in his greed, had overplayed his hand. He had based his legal attack on an asset that Alistair didn't technically own. Alistair looked at Ella, his grey eyes alight with a fierce, triumphant fire she had never seen before. "You magnificent, brilliant woman," he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion that went far beyond mere respect. He reached out his hand, covering hers on the ancient map. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of partnership. It was the touch of a man who had finally found his equal. They had the weapon they needed to fight back, but their race against time was far from over. Thorn's lawyers had set a deadline, and it was only 3 days away. They had to get proof of the Crown's ownership from the records office in London and present it before Thorn could legally seize their home. The wolf and the dove were now a united pack, and they were about to go on the hunt. The journey to London was a frantic, desperate race. Alistair and Ella travelled together, foregoing the comfort of their separate lives for the urgency of their shared mission. They were no longer the cold Earl and his rejected bride. They were partners, soldiers in a war for their home. The long hours in the rattling train carriage were filled not with silence, but with strategy, planning their approach to the Crown Lands Office. In London, they were a formidable team. Alistair's title and commanding presence opened doors that would have been closed to others, while Ella's clear, concise explanation of the legal intricacies earned the respect of the clerks and solicitors they met. After a day and a half of frantic searching through dusty archives, they found it the original Crown Survey of 1821, confirming that the mineral rights for the east reach of the Blackwood estate were indeed unassigned and held by the Crown. Armed with certified copies, they returned to Northumberland on the overnight train, arriving on the very morning of the deadline. They did not go to their lawyers. Alistair, with a grim determination, drove them straight to Thorncroft. Lord Caspian Thorn was taking his breakfast when they were announced. He greeted them with a smug, triumphant smile, believing they had come to beg for terms. "Blackwood Countess," he said smoothly, "have you come to your senses? I am prepared to be generous." Alistair didn't speak. He simply walked to the table and dropped the certified documents in front of Thorn. "Your foreclosure claim is based on a fraudulent valuation of my estate. You have attempted to secure a debt against an asset, the East Reach mineral rights, which I do not own, which it appears no one owns but the Crown." Thorn's face went pale as he scanned the documents. The legalistic language, the official seals, they were undeniable. His entire scheme had crumbled to dust. "This is an outrage, a trick," he blustered, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "No," Ella said, her voice quiet but strong as steel. "It is the truth. You, in your greed, failed to do your research. You have committed fraud, Lord Thorn. Attempting to seize assets based on false pretenses is a serious crime. I imagine the Crown solicitors would be very interested to see these papers, as would every banker you've ever dealt with." The threat was clear. They could ruin him, expose him, not as a clever predator, but as a clumsy, fraudulent fool. Thorn stared at them, his bravado gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered fear. Alistair pressed the advantage. "You will withdraw the foreclosure notice immediately. You will sell the debts you hold back to the Blackwood estate for 1/10 of their face value, and you will never ever set foot on my land or speak to my wife again. If you do not, this document goes to London on the afternoon post." Defeated Caspian Thorn slumped in his chair. He had lost. The ride back to Blackwood Manor was surreal. The autumn sun streamed through the carriage windows, bathing the landscape in a golden light. The threat that had hung over their heads for weeks had vanished. They had won. More than that, they had won. Together. As they came in sight of the manor, its grey stones looking proud and defiant in the sunlight, Alistair ordered the driver to stop. He turned to Ella, his face serious, the grey eyes that had once been so cold, now filled with a warmth that made her breath catch. "Ella," he began, his voice low and hoarse with emotion. "When we married, I saw you as a weakness, a symbol of my failure, a price I had to pay." He reached across the space between them and took her hands in his. They were strong, warm hands, no longer hesitant, but sure. "I was a blind fool," he continued. "You are not my weakness. You are the source of every strength I have discovered in myself these past months. You have more courage than any man I know, more intelligence than any scholar, and more grace than any queen. You came into my broken home and my broken life, and you did not weep or complain. You quietly, patiently began to mend them both." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "I did not love my first wife enough to save her, and I have lived in the shadow of that failure ever since. But I swear to you, Ella, I will spend the rest of my days loving you enough to deserve you, if you will let me." Tears streamed down Ella's face, not tears of humiliation or sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. This man, this impossible cold, broken Earl, had finally seen her. He hadn't just accepted her. He cherished her. "There is nothing to forgive, Alistair," she whispered. "We both had a debt to pay. Now we are free." He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation, no cold duty. His kiss was everything he had held back for so long, gratitude, respect, and a deep, soul-shattering love. It was a kiss that sealed not a bargain, but a partnership, a kiss that promised a shared future. They returned to Blackwood Manor not as an earl and his countess, but as a husband and wife. That night, for the first time, Alistair didn't go to the West Wing. He came to her, and in the quiet intimacy of her room, he showed her that the woman he once called his weakness had become his only reason, his greatest strength, and his most profound love. The Winter Earl had finally found his son, not in the ghost of a memory, but in the brilliant, resilient heart of the bride he once rejected. And so the story of Alistair and Ella comes to a close. Theirs was a love forged not in the ballrooms of London, but in the dusty ledgers and quiet corridors of a decaying home. It teaches us that true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it. Alistair believed Ella was his weakness, only to discover she was the very foundation of his redemption. Their journey from bitter rejection to undeniable love reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we initially refuse to see. If their story touched your heart, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this tale with someone who loves a story of resilience and romance. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more historical dramas that bring the passions and trials of the past to life. Thank you for listening.